You thought I had exhausted my stores of patriotism. You thought I had said everything I have to say about July 4th. But no! While you are relaxing by the pool, eating that leftover barbecue, sit back and let me tell you one more thing. So, since we're on the subject of Alfred Lord Tennyson and his banger poem about England and America in 1782, commemorating the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War, it occurred to me that I did an episode a little while back that was just nuts and bolts about how to read a poem. And I haven't done another one of those since, but you guys did say that you really liked that and that this was helpful as sort of a, basics introduction to getting to know poetry if poetry is not really your thing. And this is a perfect opportunity to do that because we've got a short poem that I think is really awesome that not that many people read, at least in my experience, and we can use it to kind of get back into these questions, these technical questions about how you can get to know a poem better if you've not really spent a ton of time with a bunch of other poetry. And I think this is a really great example of how to do that because, at least when I read it, this poem gives me a vibe. It has a very particular mood, and it's not immediately obvious to me why it has that vibe or what that vibe is, but I know it has a feeling that I associate with a certain type of thing. And so I want to look closer at it and see if the technical elements can help me figure out where that vibe comes from and what it is. So the first thing, remember to do whenever you're getting to know a new poem is just to read it, start to finish, and to read it aloud. I did that on Tuesday. I'm going to do it again now because it's short and it rules. Here we go. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea, strong mother of a lion line, be proud of those strong sons of thine who wrenched their rights from thee. What wonder if, in noble heat, those men thine arms withstood, retaught the lesson thou hadst taught, and in thy spirit with thee fought, who sprang from English blood. But thou, rejoice with liberal joy, lift up thy rocky face, and shatter, when the storms are black, in many a streaming torrent back, the seas that shock thy base. Whatever harmonies of law the growing world assume, thy work is thine, the single note from that deep chord which Hampden smote will vibrate to the doom. Okay, remember, public service that I always want to perform here, you are allowed to stop there. You don't have to be a crazy person like me and wonder why this poem makes you feel the way it makes you feel. You can just read it, kick back another White Claw, and enjoy the fact that Tennyson has constructed this very cool and rousing tribute to the Anglo-American relationship about 100 years on in the 19th century. You do not have to be as obsessive as I am about to be, but if you want to be, it can be really fun. And this is one of the classic use cases for knowing some of the technical formal elements of poetry. And I'm going to plug here again this one little book, The Making of a Poem, a Norton anthology of poetic forms. I will link to it in the description of this episode so that you can check it out yourself if you like. Really great introduction to some of the typical ways that people have structured poems, and this is particularly important when you have a work like this one that is just reminding you of something but you're not quite sure what. This is where you want to dig into the formal elements of the structure to figure out what exactly this tradition is that the poem is making use of. And it might be multiple different poetic traditions that are being invoked here, but it's sort of like with music, right? If I go dun 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 in a movie score, you know that I'm referring back to Beethoven. And there are certain little structures or motifs or traditions that give you particular vibes, versus if I go, I'm working late because I'm a singer, right? I'm participating in a whole different realm there. I'm evoking a bunch of other associations. And just like there are kind of pop song sounds and there are particular different flavors of that kind of sound, you can get the synthy vibey kind of pop, or you can get the hard rock guitar kind of pop or whatever. And then there are a whole other sort of range of like classical music sounds and different traditions in classical music. In just the same way, in poetry, you've got all these different traditions and different flavors of traditions within the tradition and all that different stuff. And when you are trying to place a poem, you can start by placing it within its traditions by asking just 3 basic technical questions about it. And those technical questions are, what kind of stanza are we using? And the stanza is like the block of verse that typically looks on the page like a paragraph, essentially. How many lines per stanza? Is it the same number of lines each time? And does that number of lines kind of go with a certain kind of poetry? And then similarly with the rhyme, what is the rhyme scheme? Do the ends of the lines rhyme? Is there a particular pattern that repeats in each stanza, or is it different for every stanza? Is there no rhyme? Is this alliterative verse instead? That whole series of questions will help you to place it as well, because if you're writing in heroic couplets, that's going to be a different thing than if you're writing in, say, a sonnet rhyme scheme. And then there's the meter, which is the rhythm of the verse, which we've talked about before, the number of syllables per line, whether that is regular, and whether it fits, again, within a recognizable set of patterns. And once you can ask these 3 questions about the poem, you can start to ask where it sits in the traditions that it's making use of. Because the key here is to know that every poem stands closely or distantly in relationship to every other poem. Certainly every other poem that's ever been written in that language, but in a broader sense, in every other poem ever. And of course, some poems are going to be very, very distantly related, and some poems are going to be closely related, and this is how you can kind of locate the poem and start to understand what it's doing with its traditions. And you can maybe think about this if you're a mathematical person or you're into science. In AI now, when they're trying to categorize words and images, they make these things called embeddings, where they give you kind of numerical representations of different words. And to vastly oversimplify, you would have like, the category bird is all going to be, in the range of like 1 to 5, versus if you have a cheeseburger, that's going to get a 10, so it's going to be graphed distantly in the embedding. And that sort of visual representation kind of locates different words or concepts closer to one another. The space of stanzas, rhyme schemes, and meters gives you this kind of 3-dimensional formal network grid for you to map the different poems onto and place them closer or further away from one another. Sometimes in math you talk about a probability space, which is like a kind of array of different probabilities or possibilities. And this idea of form in poetry gives you what I would call a possibility space. It's the backdrop of all the different possible ways that you could make poetry, so that then you know where this particular poem is going to sit. And once you know where it sits formally, then you can start to see what the poet is doing with his tradition, because all good poems are written with some awareness of this. And this poem has a unique set of coordinates in this formal space that the poet will know about. And this even includes like when the poem is written relative to other poems that are in the same kind of form. So if I write a sonnet today, that means something different than if I write a sonnet in the Elizabethan era, or if I'm Thomas Wyatt writing a sonnet. That's new and innovative and exciting. If I'm Spencer Clavin in 2024 writing a sonnet, that's kind of retro, and it's evocative of this huge tradition, and my sonnet stands in a different relationship to all other poems than Thomas Wyatt's sonnet does, and yet it stands closer to other sonnets than it does, let's say, to villanelles or other kinds of poetry, blank verse, let's say. Similarly, a sonnet that breaks all the rules of sonetry, where every line has something sort of off or unusual given its typical meter or whatever, that's a different kind of sonnet than a sonnet that perfectly hews to the form except for in one particular place. And Shakespeare, for example, has different kinds of sonnets that do different things. Some of them break the rules a lot. Some of them are very, very sparing with their use of kind of rule breakage or transgression. And that too kind of places the poem in relationship to others and gives it its particular flavor and can help you to understand whatever vibe it is that you're getting, whatever flavor you're feeling from the poem. And so I thought this Tennyson poem is a great example of this, because when I read it, and I feel like I sort of know a fair bit about poetry, English verse, but when I read it, I was like, this has a very distinctive feeling that I can't quite place. To use another metaphor, it was like sipping a wine and you're like, oh, there's a really strong flavor in this, or a whiskey, and you're like, oh, that's a really strong flavor, but you can't quite yet say, yeah, that's vanilla, or oh, that's charcoal, right? And those funny tasting notes you get in wine, usually you start out with this kind of sense in the back of your mind that there's something, and you have to kind of narrow in, and the way you do that is by tasting a bunch of different wines or whiskeys, or in this case, reading a bunch of different poems and getting to know how each one stands in relationship to the others. So let me ask these three basic questions about stanza, rhyme, and meter in order to try and understand the Tennyson poem better. Stanzas, right? This one has a very regular set of stanzas. I noticed that there are 5 lines for every stanza. O thou that sendest out the man, that's 1 line. To rule by land and sea, that's 2 lines. Strong mother of a lion line, that's 3. Be proud of those strong sons of thine, that's 4. Who wrench their rights from thee, that's 5. And all the stanzas look basically the same. This is a kind of stanza called a cinquain, meaning that it's got 5 lines. That's the cinque root from Italian, and indeed continental Europe is sort of the source for this kind of poetry. It makes its way into English verse from that tradition. The same tradition that gives English the sonnet also gives it the cinquain, and in much the same way, much like the sonnet, the cinquain kind of takes shape in English in this courtly environment of hyper-sophistication, careful allusion. The person that is most often mentioned in connection as like an example of sort of the early 16th century English cinquain is going to be Sir Philip Sidney, who is best known for his essay In Defense of Poesy, but is generally sort of an Elizabethan courtier and writes very elaborate, sly, cheeky, elusive verses. That doesn't explain the vibe. That does tell me something about this poem, which is that it's working in kind of an English tradition that Tennyson would have been very comfortable with and familiar in. But it's more like that backdrop is kind of like a neutral backdrop for the story to be told. Because one thing about cinquains, unlike sonnets, is that they can go on forever. You can have as many cinquains as you want, and they sort of offer you this runway along which to tell a story or to convey a particular image or whatever. That's sort of a more versatile and extendable form than the sonnet. And knowing that about this poem does help me a little bit, but when I looked back at like what Sidney wrote and some of the other famous examples of cinquains, I mean, Edgar Allan Poe wrote some famous cinquain poems, but even so, the use of the cinquain in those poems didn't really clue me into like what it is that makes this particular poem distinctive. So that's gonna, I guess, in this case, be more like the backdrop, because this is not a courtly poem exactly, although the idea of that does kind of elevate the poem a little bit. But when I really think about the parts of this poem that are giving me the feeling I'm getting, and the particular tasting note that I want to zero in on here, it's sort of like I'm feeling a cross between an ode, so a classical poem in celebration of a victory, or in praise of a particular person, or in this case, 2 particular nations. I've got that mood, but I've also got a kind of sea shanty feeling, like a rollicking, rolling adventure. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea. And I think what's giving me that feeling? Well, it's the first 2 lines of every stanza and the last 2 lines of every stanza. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea. You can almost hear like, soon may the weathermen come to bring us sugar and tea and rum, right? It's got that feeling. And the same thing happens at the end of every stanza. Be proud of those strong sons of thine who wrenched their rights from thee. So now I'm starting to think maybe this is kind of about rhyme and rhythm. And in fact, when I turn to my next major question about what's the rhyme scheme, I do find there's a very definite and kind of distinctive rhyme scheme. And cinquains often have, this is one of the classic cinquain rhyme schemes. It goes A, B, C, C, B. So the first line is its own concept. There's no rhyme with the first line. But then the second line rhymes with the last line, and then the third and fourth lines rhyme together. So you've got a little tight couplet before the whole thing is sort of tied up with this B rhyme. A, B, C, C, B. And at the same time, you're combining that with the meter, which is very particular. Now, remember, we name and classify meters based on how many syllables there are in each line and the pattern of stress within the line. So here I've got the first line has 8 syllables, and they are grouped into iambs, which is short, long, da, da, unstressed, stressed. O thou that sendest out the man, that's 4 iambs. To rule by land and sea, that's 3 iambs. Strong mother of a lion line, 4 again. Be proud of those strong sons of thine, 4 again, who wrench their rights from thee. So the technical name for this would be iambic tetrameter in the first line, alternating occasionally with iambic trimeter, 4 iambs versus 3 iambs. And now, it was actually as I was analyzing this that I started to realize I know where I've heard this before. It's Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And it's not exactly the same, but this is a famous romantic poem from the 19th century as well. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest thou me? This, you'll notice, as just to give an example, has a different, is not as rigid in its form as Tennyson, and Coleridge tends to be more loose and free with his meter than Tennyson does, but it's the same idea. It's tetrameter alternating with trimeter. Iambic tetrameter, it is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3 with iambic trimeter, and the whole thing kind of goes on like that, at least to open. And this is what made me realize, oh, I know what I'm picking up on here. This is the ballad form. So ballads, which are kind of old troubadour songs that lie in the background of a lot of our more formal verse, have this classic alternating tetrameter, trimeter structure. And you can go on like that forever. So think of yourself with like your lute outside the window of your beloved. Maybe she's betrothed to another man, but you must confess your love to her. And so you're playing on your lute and you're going da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, or else maybe everyone's gathered around the fire at the inn, and arise ye hearties, and hear the tale of, Cendric the Floozler, or whatever, right? Some grand adventure story that's going to come, maybe a knightly poem in the case of the Ancient Mariner, right? The story of this mariner who was trapped at sea and ends up a sadder but a wiser man. Or perhaps he makes the hero a sadder but a wiser man. Probably both, I guess. You're playing your lute, right? This is the vibe that you're getting here is the troubadour vibe of the ballad. And yet, now we're really getting somewhere because we notice that although Tennyson has placed himself, I'm sure consciously, within a balladeer tradition, he would have been well aware that that's what he was doing. He loved these medieval kind of courtly stories and ideas from the knightly era of England's past. But he's not just doing the A-B structure that we might expect from the simplest possible ballad. And that's what Coleridge does, right? It is an ancient mariner. He stoppeth one of 3. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest thou me? So Coleridge, much like Tennyson, is hearkening back here to an earlier form. But he's giving us much more of the feel, kind of unadulterated, of that storytelling idea, right? And Coleridge, like Tennyson, loved to resurrect these more, let's say, folksy forms that came from the distant past. And yet, Tennyson has kind of sculpted this form into something a little bit different, and he's done it by inserting this CC couplet and making it into a cinquain. So he's taken the classic ballad and he's cinquainified it so that it has more of a courtly lilt to it and is just a little bit more sculpted and refined. And each stanza takes this very particular and carefully constructed journey. He's given it a shape. that instead of just going this, this, and this, and then this, this, and this, and this, this, and this, and this, this, and this, we actually kind of are pulled up short a little bit by this rousing couplet in the middle. What wonder if in noble heat those men thine arms withstood, retaught the lesson thou hadst taught, and in thy spirit with thee fought, who sprang from English blood. And this, to me, kind of adds something a little bit more courtly, a little bit more cinquainy than the classic ballad, or maybe even something that comes like out of the bob and wheel structure of the Gawain poem and other kind of Middle English stories of the knights, right? So we've got this really distinctive blend of influences here that both harkens back to early days before the Industrial Revolution and before even the High Renaissance into maybe this medieval troubadour attitude, but also layers over a certain degree of sophistication, elegance, and courtly sentiment in this packaged, neat little 4-stanza structure. And so it's this combination of adventuresome daring-do with the ballad form and refinement, kind of elegance, clarity, just like the interaction between Britain, the established maritime power, the elegant, loving mother, the strong and proud ancient nation, and America, the rollicking, newfound, adventuresome younger son, right, of the great empire of Britannia, or whatever, right? There's a beautiful marriage going on here that I hadn't noticed before between form and content. And the whole thing kind of flows seamlessly into a poem that seems not really be doing that much with form until you start thinking about it, and until you specifically catch that idea that is going to be there whether you think about it or not. So this is the really beautiful thing, is that, as I said at the beginning, you don't have to do all of this work to figure out exactly, you don't have to do all this work to feel what you feel. You're gonna feel it. There's a kind of catch in your throat that each stanza gives you almost automatically. But if you take the time to kind of analyze and understand why you feel what you feel, then suddenly you have this new grasp of the poem and an appreciation for what Tennyson is doing, in much the same way that you don't have to draw out the tablature of Let It Be in order to be moved by the Beatles' work. But if you do, and you sort of examine at a music theoretical level what they're doing, you might come to understand that the reason that has this particularly hooky but also emotional power is because of this, this, and that chord or whatever. It's exactly the same thing with poetry. And this poem, I think, just gets better the more you read it and the more carefully you pay attention to it. So one more time to send us off here for July 4th, or I suppose July 5th, and I hope you are still celebrating. Here's England and America in 1782. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea, strong mother of a lion line, be proud of those strong sons of thine who wrenched their rights from thee. What wonder if, in noble heat, those men thine arms withstood, retaught the lesson thou hadst taught, and in thy spirit with thee fought, who sprang from English blood. But thou rejoice, with liberal joy, lift up thy rocky face, and shatter, when the storms are black, in many a streaming torrent back, the seas that shock thy base. Whatever harmonies of law the growing world assume, thy work is thine, the single note from that deep chord which Hampden smote will vibrate to the doom. One more time to bring us home. Happy 4th of July. I will see you next week for our regularly scheduled programming, and as always, more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.